Good afternoon or good evening, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird, and I'm the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support once again to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event will be a special roundtable on February 16th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to discuss the work and legacy of the great writer, Janet Malcolm. The panelists will include Michael Greenberg, Katie Royf, Jean Strauss, and Benjamin Taylor. Please mark your calendars and register for this free event on the Leon Levy website. And please sign up for our email list. But tonight we are here to celebrate Carole Angier's new biography of W.G. Sebald. Angier will be in conversation with our own Thad Ziolkowski. Carole Angier is the author of Jean Rhys, Life and Work, which won the Writers Guild Award for nonfiction and was shortlisted for the Whitbread Prize. She's also the author of The Double Bond, Primo Levi, a biography, following the publication of which she was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. She lives in Oxfordshire. Thad Ziolkowski is the Associate Director of the Leon Levy Center and the author of Our Son, the Arson, a collection of poems, the memoir On a Wave, which was a finalist for the PEN Martha Albrand Award in 2003, and Wichita, a novel. His book, The Drop, most recently, which is a book that explores the relationship between surfing and addiction, and was published by HarperCollins in 2021. His essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, Slate, Book Forum, Art Forum, Travel, Leisure, Interview Magazine, and Index. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and has a PhD in English literature from Yale University. Please look for these books online at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. Thad will now conduct a conversation with Carole for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the chat box below to type in your questions, and I'm sure Thad will get to as many as he can. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. Thad, I now turn the rest of the evening's event over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kai. I am delighted to be here. Thank you, Carole, for being with me. What I'd like to do now, Carole, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, Thad.
Okay, great. So what I'd like to do when we address biographies of artists or writers is just to kind of foreground the fact that the primary thing that justifies attention to Sebald, in this case, Winfried Georg Sebald, born 1944 and died in 2001. The whole point of the biography, or the thrust of the biography of Sebald, is that he's a great writer. And so what I want to sort of talk about in the beginning is what it is about Sebald's writing that makes him be considered a major writer, what he achieved in the sort of flavor of his style and his approach to prose. And so if you and I could just talk about that a bit and to kind of establish that as the ground for the rest of it, because it's so often that that will just get passed over as a given. But I think it's something that I want to kind of celebrate a little bit and pinpoint before we get going on the life itself.
Right. Well, I think it's the right place to start, Thad, isn't it? I think the point about Sebald as a writer, what makes him so extraordinary is that he is genuinely unique in a way and original in his style in so many different ways, and in both languages, English and his original German, because he wrote, of course, all of his books originally in German. And what he does in both languages is quite extraordinary, because, I mean, in his German originals, he's writing in a kind of 19th century style that has not been, nobody wrote like that in Germany since the 19th century, sort of, or early 20th, Thomas Mann, or, very, very long, complex, multi-clausal sentences that kind of, rise and rise, as he says about Thomas Browne, who was one of his models really for that. So, and then in his English is as we were talking about earlier on, Thad, you and I, he took his translators' drafts, or his translators' versions, his first translator, Michael Hulse, who's a poet, and produced these very poetic and beautiful drafts. And Sebald then took those and rewrote them. He re-Germanized them because Hulse had Englished them. He re-Sebaldianized them because Hulse had Hulsed them. And basically he produced a language which is not normal English. It's not spoken anywhere. It's not written anywhere. It's a different language. And because he's writing about a world which is a different world as well, we might talk about that, it's completely all of a piece. So both his German and his English versions are quite extraordinary and different from anyone else's. And also, I think so many other things to be said. I mean, they're so beautiful. His language is so beautiful. His landscape descriptions, his remarks and insights and comments on the characters are deeply moving and strange often, and unusual and just lovely. I mean, all the endings of each of the stories of the emigrants, for example, the first book that was translated into English, the endings of every one of those stories have a great, great beauty. They're poetic in themselves. I always quote the ending of Dr. Henry Selwyn, since it's my favorite story. I'm going to read it because otherwise I'll get it wrong. And each word is so important. So the last sentence is, "And so they are ever returning to us, the dead. At times they come back from the ice more than 7 decades later and are found at the edge of the moraine, a few polished bones and a pair of hobnailed boots." Who else could have written that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you identify about Sebald that I loved was the E.M. Forster says that fiction must have a kind of atmosphere of mystery. And he achieves that. And that's that kind of breath of life. Another way we say it in English often is it has the breath of life. But in Sebald, I think the word mystery gets at it a lot too. And, you and I both encountered Sebald with the English translation of The Immigrants. Like most everyone, I think, in the English-speaking world, that was the first book to come out. And you found yourself with a copy of it, and you were asked to review it, I believe, and then you went and interviewed him. Perhaps you could talk a bit about that first encounter with how it's a lot to me. It's a little odd that you went straight to the writer to interview him. I would have just read the book and reviewed it. But what did you, was that part of your assignment to go interview him?
Well, I did review it as well, of course. I reviewed it first. It was just sent to me to review out of the blue because I'm a foreigner in England. And so I got a lot of foreign books sent to me. I was sent Primo Levi to review as well. Anyway, I was sent this book to review, The Emigrants, and I had never heard of W.G. Sebald. And so I just thought, well, who is this, And I opened the book up and I just could not believe what I was reading. It was so extraordinary. It was so, as I've already said, unlike anything else I'd ever read, which is something that Susan Sontag says as well, of course, or said. And I was just blown away by the beauty and movingness and extraordinary power of these 4 stories. And so I wrote a review. I wrote the review. I sent it to review. I wrote the review. It was a rave review. And but I'm a biographer, Thad. Whenever I read something, particularly something that so astonishes me, my first thought is, who is this person? How did this mind get to be like this? One of the things that we haven't said, partly because it's usually one of the first things to be said, is that one of the reasons he is so admired and loved as a writer is he is one of the very few, if not the only, post-war German writers who writes about the victims or the survivors of the Holocaust with such intense empathy and imaginative identification and power, And that's, of course, what also moved me so extraordinarily about the immigrants, because I come from my parents were refugees from Vienna, from Hitler, and therefore it spoke to me very personally, these stories. And so I just automatically thought, who is this? How can I find out? And so I just went round sort of magazines and newspapers and said, would you like me to interview this person, this writer, this wonderful writer? And one magazine, the Jewish Quarterly, said yes. And so I wrote to Sebald and said, I'd like to interview him. And could I come and interview him? And I wrote from the Jewish Quarterly, and I really think that was one reason why he accepted, because he did accept. So my interview was the first one in England to be done with him. And that's how it happened. So I went up to UEA in Norfolk and knocked on his door. And this very German man opened the door. Very sort of South German Munich kind of man, because I had been working in Munich and I had met some of the Munich sort of intelligentsia, and he struck me straight away like that. And then he spoke with a wonderful, what's one of the things about him, he had the most extraordinary voice, very, very deep, rich voice. And he spoke with accent, not so much just from Bavaria, but from the part of Bavaria he came from, which was the Allgäu, which is up in the mountains, the Alps. And is and one of its characteristic things is that they roll their R's fantastically, very strongly, and he did that. So anyway, I was charmed. I just thought this is a wonderful person as well as a wonderful writer.
And it emerged when you asked him about the story, especially Dr. Hugh Selwyn, the first story in The Immigrants, which is, you say, your favorite, yes?
Yes, it is, yes.
And you asked him about the crucial detail in that story, which is that Selwyn is Jewish. Tell the story about that and how Sebald responded to you.
Yes, well, you see, he's just such a fascinating subject because he's a very strange mind, which I still don't understand, of course. But we talked about Dr. Henry Selwyn, and he said to me, yes, that he had been his landlord. And he said, I discovered that he was Jewish in this way, in a different way from the way I tell in the story. He said, I found it out in a different way, that I went to I was invited to a Christmas party that Dr. Selwyn and his wife gave, and I was introduced to a lady there as his sister from Tel Aviv. And when he said that, I thought, oh, I see. Now he's not just an ordinary English gent, which is what he appears. So the way he told that to me was absolutely convincingly that the model was Jewish, just and masquerading as an English gentleman, just as Dr. Selwyn. I was completely convinced of this, so I put it in my interview, and this turned out to be completely false. It was not true, although people repeated it. The way people then repeat things when they read it in print. It's one of the things you've got to admit responsibility for if you put something wrong in print. Anyway, now, why did he do this? Most extraordinary. And you actually asked me, didn't you? Did I then go and, try and find out about that family and that place because of that deception? And the answer to that is no, because I didn't know it at the time. You see, I just decided as a biographer that I was going to, follow up the places of his life and the people of his life. And it's when I did that, that's the order in which it happened. When I then spoke to the family, I discovered that he'd made up the whole thing. Well, no.
And how many years elapsed? How many years elapsed between the time he told you that?
Many. He lived there in 1970 I went and talked to the surviving daughter-in-law of Dr. Selwyn, or the model for Dr. Selwyn, in 2014.
So there was a time, so it was 1996 that he told you that Dr. Selwyn, the model for Dr. Selwyn was Jewish, and until 2014 that you lived under the impression that that was the truth. Now, what was it like for you to find out that that was not the truth, that he was not Jewish? What did that do to your sense of the story? And what are we talking about anyway? When we're talking about this thing that Sebald published, yes, it has models in real life, but are we holding him to that? In a way we are and we aren't, right? I mean, he's writing under the aegis of fiction, is he not? Isn't the immigrants?
Indeed.
So he, in his way, is strictly within the law. He's okay to, but it's but in another way, it was crucial that that be true, right? Because what does it do if it's not true for
Exactly.
Sebald?
See,
So
what he does is as unique as his style. By putting the photographs into the fiction and deliberately playing with the genres, between fiction and nonfiction, he's inviting everyone, the reader, to believe that this is not fiction. I mean, these are real people. We look at them, we look into their eyes, we suffer with them, and we believe that they're real. And he wanted us to believe they're real. That was the point, I think that's why he put the photographs in. And I think that's why he told me that strange fiction, because when he was growing up in Germany and becoming more and more exercised and worried by the past, which was being hidden from him, he never met a Jewish person because there weren't any in that part of Germany. There weren't very many anywhere in Germany when he was growing up, for obvious reasons. And it wasn't until he came to England when he was 22 that he actually met real live Jewish people, particularly his landlord, whom he seemed to use his landlord several times. This was a Jewish refugee landlord of his whom he used for the story Max Ferber. So that encounter with the real person was transformative for him. I mean, he'd been worrying about this. He knew about it. All Germans know about it. The whole world knows about it. But encountering a real live person was, revelatory to him. And he says so. He says, he realized that there weren't numbers, there weren't even names. There was somebody who lived across the road from you, or across the landing. And he said of his landlord, this was somebody who lived in Munich, and he had walked the same streets and had skied the same hills. And he'd finally met one. So he wanted to create that encounter. All of his books are like that. We are encountering Austerlitz through the narrator. He's always going to the original person, whose story we have to hear. And the narrator narrates it, as it were, or conveys it. So he wanted us to have that same shock of meeting the real person. So he put the photographs in so that we have that experience. But then on the other hand, of course, we do realize that this is a fiction, that he's writing fiction, because it's structured in such an extraordinarily, tight way with, for example, the repetition of, Nabokov, who appears in every one of the four. He's the sort of connecting image. You think, well, this is fiction. So who are these people? You see, who are the photographs of? So basically, he's doing something which is wonderfully present and startling, but at the same time confusing and difficult, because we are talking about survivors of the Holocaust here. We are talking about, people about whom it might be dangerous to suggest doubts about who are they and are they really real, So I think it becomes complicated, more complicated. If he just wrote normal fiction, just the way that people write fiction, then although, subjects, people who are used by writers, as we've just been saying, get pretty cross anyway, very often. But in this case, it's more acute. It's more acute, more powerful as an original experience, and more disturbing than when the questions arise, in a way.
Yeah, photography is a feature of his work that we haven't mentioned. I mean, that's a part of the originality and the genre bending that we're trying to make sense of as we talk about what he's actually doing, what he's claiming to do and what he's actually doing. Photography, the inclusion of photography, the use of inaccurate or thrift shop photographs that he would find and include. He's deliberately muddying the water of referentiality and accuracy and truth and verifiability and truth with photography. So I think that's part of what intensifies this, the whole quest for the truth. But your biography itself has been an occasion for a lot of opprobrium with regard to Sebald on this score. He's deceitful. He's not this kind of noble, truth-telling German after all. And I wanted to get your take on the reviews. I mean, you've had some extraordinary reviews of this book by some extraordinarily, refined literary writers. But some of it has struck me as a bit unfair, as we were talking about before with the Joan Didion line where she says a writer is always selling someone out. I instinctively felt on behalf of Sebald that he was being judged too harshly. But when I read your book, I thought, wait a second, this is actually it's more fraught than I had thought. And you do such a great job of teasing out the nuances of it all and also getting the shock of the models for him. And so I guess, but backing up a bit, I wanted to get your sense of the whether or not your biography has been an occasion for a kind of course correction or a correction downward of his reputation. Is this the beginning of a downward turn of his reputation, or where how do you feel about that?
Well, desperate. I mean, if that were to be, the case, then obviously I would rather I'd never written it. But that's absurd, isn't it? I mean, I'm a biographer. I'm not writing some kind of whitewashing. When I discovered that he had some strange behaviors and even some less attractive behaviors, for example, the way that he behaved to his first translator, which was, to put it mildly, unkind, and then also to some of his models, whom he was not, very, well, he didn't kind of suffer over using their stories, or think he did suffer. I mean, he wrote about it. He knew that there was a particular moral risk and danger in a German writing Jewish stories, even more than normal, if you know what I mean. And he understood that, and he tormented himself about it. But he did it as carefully as anyone could. In the works themselves, the distance that he keeps from the experience, the narrator is always a great distance between the terrible experiences that we are learning about and the narrator, the representative of the writer, who is simply conveying what the real sufferer suffered. So he did it in his work very, very delicately, extremely delicately and carefully. He was less delicate about some of the ways he treated individual models. I mean, he wasn't cruel or anything, but he just wasn't, he thought only about his work and how to convey their stories rather than, so he didn't ask several people, could I use this story? Even though he did actually say that he had asked them. He did ask some, but he didn't ask all. So I do reveal this. Well, I mean, is this terrible? I mean, why have people rounded on him? It seemed to me really childish somehow. Of course, this is defending myself as much as Sebald, because it's I who have told this story. And so, as I've said to you earlier, I am selling Sebald out in that sense, that I'm telling truths about him, what I believe to be truths, given all my researches. And, but I don't think that what he did was so terrible. He wrote great works. What's more important is how he wrote these stories and how living these stories are, how he has, he's a major reason why we cannot forget. And that's all that really, or that's what matters most. So I just found those reactions strange, and disturbing. And I was, of course, sorry if people took that kind of line. But, when Andrew Motion, for example, who wrote a marvelous biography of Philip Larkin, and exposed Larkin's misogyny and anti-Semitism and so on. And after that biography came out, quite a few people said, I'm never going to read Larkin again. And well, that wasn't Andrew's fault. That was their fault. and I just
Well, I
take
think
it from you.
this is the world we live in. It's very highly sensitive toward lanes, especially in the United
Yes.
States. There's a lot of focus on cultural appropriation, a
Well,
phrase
that's
which
right.
comes up
That's
in one
right.
of the reviews because
Yes.
Sebald is found out to be, you know, kind of consuming and basing a narrative on other uncredited Jewish sources of memoirs that were published and unpublished and so forth. And this also comes out in your book. I mean, I think ultimately the more sophisticated reviews sort of forgive him for this because of the achievement, the uses to which he puts it. But it is easy to round on him, as you say, and go after him on that score if, as a perhaps as a kind of competitor writer, you want to take him down a notch. So I think there's some of that going
Well, I
on.
certainly don't. You see, this is what's so interesting. You know, you're absolutely right that the key issue is cultural appropriation. This is not to do with his models and the extra things that I discovered and revealed. This is to do with the simple primary fact that he was a German writing Jewish stories. Now, and that was the case from the beginning. And, you know, we now have, don't we, quite a very powerful current doctrine, which says this is cultural appropriation and is illegitimate. And particularly illegitimate when a member of the perpetrator group, as it were, you know, writes about a member of the victim group. Now, my experience as a member, as it were, of the victim group, my parents escaped and, you know, lost their identities, but they didn't lose their lives. As a member of that group, I have no resentment and no anger against him. I am only grateful. I was just astonished and moved that precisely he, as a German, a non-Jewish German, you know, son of a soldier who fought throughout the whole of the war on all fronts, that he was able to write this powerful, imaginative, empathetic stories. And I thought that was greater than if a Jewish person had written them. I mean, many Jewish people have written them marvelously, but the fact that he did that, so far from seeming to me to be a, you know, a form of stealing or appropriation, on the contrary, this is what literature is about. Literature is about extending your imagination to others, you know, not just to you and your narrow group. And if we are forced to do that now out of, you know, wanting to not offend, that's wrong, it seems to me. I think that's wrong. And I feel I can say it about the Jewish experience, being Jewish myself, that I certainly do not feel he's culturally appropriating anything. He's imaginatively identifying and expanding everyone's knowledge of these stories. And thank you, W.G. Sebald.
Very good. I want to hold the book up to get everyone to see it and to remind everyone that I've posted a link to bookshops.org where you can purchase this. The title is very Nabokovian. Sebald loves Nabokov, and this is, of course, an allusion to Nabokov's memoir, Speak Memory. You
Yes.
call this Speak Silence. Talk a little bit, if you would, about the silences in Sebald's world and how you address them, the biographic problem of addressing silence. It's a fascinating category. And it's in your title, so I feel obliged to kind of put you on the spot with that.
Well, yeah, fair enough. Well, you know, the central silences that I am referring to in my title are the silences that he grew up under, and his whole generation did. I mean, he was born in 1944, so he belongs to the generation is called the second generation in Germany, who are the children of those who lived through the Third Reich. And he, you know, throughout his growing up, and he did live in a very small town, first in a village and then in a small town, but it was pretty well universal. I mean, in Germany, there was something which is called Vergangenheitsverwaltung, which, you know, means overcoming the past. And there was a very admirable public policy to make people understand what had happened and not keep quiet and silent about it. But that was a public policy, and it didn't really penetrate into private families and so on. So he grew up with this silence around him about what had happened, like just before he was born, or when he was born. And his family wouldn't talk about it. His father wouldn't talk about it. As he got older, he tried to, make his father talk. He asked him, what had he seen? What had he known? Did he know about what was happening to the Jews and so on? And his father would always refuse to reply and say he didn't remember. And then they would end up having the most terrible fights. So it never really worked. And so he, this was the rest of his life. He learned more and more about this. And this is what became the great burden that he carried. He talked about it as, a Medusa head that you'd carry around with you and not dare look at. And this was the silence, the first silence. The other silence was also a second silence, which he grew up in as well, was about the bombing of the German cities. Germans didn't talk about that either. I mean, when he was a child, he was taken to Munich at one point, and when he was only like 4, so we're talking about 1948, and of course, Munich was still in rubble everywhere, the Trümmer that was, and he, writes rather affectingly and amusingly even about how he always thought that that's what a city was. A city was, big buildings and big piles of rubble. And, nobody would talk about that. He knew that he couldn't ask his father, what is that? Because his father was, there was a taboo. And there was a taboo about that because of the shame of it, that Germans had been told that they were going to rule the world, that all the vermin were going to be cleaned, destroyed. And then, at the end of the war, they were having to live like vermin themselves, hiding in cellars and, terrible starvation and all sorts of dreadful things that were not possible to face. So they didn't face it. So they just, we all know, had this wonderful Wirtschaftswunder, the 1950s and so on, and the great explosion of German prosperity, or the building up of German. So they just became rich and very, very clean, and they cleared and tidied away all the, evidence of the past. That's what Sebald always says, the German landscape frightened him because it was always cleaned out. He said, in Britain, every village has its history visible on the faces of its houses. Whereas in Germany, everybody gets rid of the past straight away, and then they launder everything. And they launder everything because they are ashamed of it. Mm. So the Germans couldn't face their past any more than the survivors, because his stories are all about how those who survived the Holocaust can't face their losses. They hide them from themselves and from everyone else. And it's only late in life, when their defenses begin to crumble, that they, Austerlitz begins to find out, to break down, really. He has to break down before he can face these memories. And similarly, Max Ferber, and similarly, Dr. Selwyn. I mean, they all, apart from Max Ferber, they all end up killing themselves. Well, Austerlitz doesn't, but in the immigrants. So, the terrible silence that everybody kept after the war about these unspeakable things on both sides, because the victims didn't speak to their children either. I have some in my own family. They never spoke. Very, very, very late. 1 or 2 started to do that, and to do what Primo Levi did, which is speak in schools and so on. They eventually, but only when they were old. So this terrible silence, which is to do with trauma and, the inability to face trauma, really. And that's, I think, a major theme of his books.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the lines from your book that I wanted you to gloss in this regard is, you say, how to represent violence was always a moral problem for Sebald, and silence his solution. What did you mean by that in that context about silence?
Well, one of the reasons I put it that way was I was trying in my, minor way to do what he does, and that is to, or what any writer does, which is to thread the book with some imagery and some, thematic, some motifs, you know what I mean? So whenever I was writing about some aspect of someone not saying something, or I would use the word silence deliberately in order to echo the title and to keep that motif going, But what I meant by that line is, as we know, that Sebald actually in his great books about, the emigrants and at the beginning and Austerlitz at the end, which are the two, as it were, post-Holocaust books about Holocaust survivors, because he never writes about the Holocaust itself. He never goes into a concentration camp or shows atrocities or anything like that. It's always about the survivors. Well, oh dear, I'm losing the track here. Where was I heading? He never uses the word Jew. He never uses the word Holocaust or Shoah or anything. He never uses any of these words. And yet they're always, that's what's in the background. That's what the subject is, that what we know it's all about, but he never actually names it. He never names any of it.
Yes,
So
that's great. Yeah. No, that gets at it for me. Thank you. I mean, I think it's in a way, it's another way of saying indirection or sort of, or yeah, sleight of hand. Yeah, very good. In terms of his arc as a writer, there was a long period, it looked to me like gestation, where he seems just like an academic, like a struggling minor academic. He goes to England and he has this life in Manchester at the University of East Anglia. And we don't see the work for which he's known until he doesn't publish that until he's in his early 40s, right? Is that true? And
Yes.
now, how do you see the Sebald we know and love emerge from this academic writing in an academic discourse during those 20 years when a lot of writers are producing their big works?
Yes, it's very interesting. That's another way in which he's unusual. He always said in interviews and told people that he had never intended to be a writer, and that he just turned to writing late on in his academic life when his academic routine was beginning to bore and stress him. And what it's one of the many exposures and sellings out of him that I do, that I show that is completely false. That is a very self-protective fiction. So when he was first of all, he wrote poetry and stories in his school magazine and in his university magazines, And at his first university, he met two friends and they formed this little group of writers. And the three of them were determined to write the great German novel. I mean, he was 19 and 20 years old, you see. So that was the truth very, very early on. And then when he did become an academic, and that was how he earned his living, and during all those years that he was, as it were, just, so to speak, being an academic, he was also writing poetry. He always wrote poetry. But, and he always made fun of himself, or, made it sound, he was just say, he did his scribbling, his kritzeln, that was what he did. So he played it down, but that's what he was doing. But then what happened was that when he was, he was always emotionally not very stable. He probably had the first breakdown in his life when he was only 18, just not even quite 18, when various things came together. One of the main ones being that he saw a film of the liberation of several of the concentration camps, which was this film was shown in German schools, and he saw that with all his classmates, of course. And various other things happened to him at that time. He lost his faith. He was brought up Catholic. He lost his faith at that point. He was told at one point, he was diagnosed as having a heart ailment, something wrong with his heart, all of which is unlikely to be true. I suggest in my book that it was not true, that it was a myth, or at least it was a mistake, but because he was always very, very, very physically active. Anyway, all these things came together and he did have a breakdown at that time. And then he had a very bad breakdown in his first term at Manchester, which he describes in Max Ferber, which, the narrator is described in this condition. And then when he was 35, he had a very serious breakdown. Probably the most serious. And this one really was what started him writing. I believe, is when he came back from a journey that he took across, a walk that he took, travel that he took across northern Italy and into his native, village, which he describes in Vertigo, which is his first piece of prose writing. And that, what he describes in Vertigo is a man who is clearly in extremis emotionally or mentally, and is having even paranoid delusions, and he imagines he tells us he's being followed by two young men who want to murder him, basically. And it turns out these two young men are the very famous or notorious real murderers of that period of the early 1980s, Abel and Forlan. Anyway, it's really scary. And that and the first piece of poetry great poem that he published even before Vertigo, these are all explorations of this breakdown. I believe that's how I interpret them. And I think that is why he started writing, in order to explore this mental dilemma of his, and or suffering of his, and to try and understand it and to try and deal with it, and the story that he just got bored with academic life. I mean, he was bored with academic life, but that wasn't the reason. That wasn't.
No. Well, I think that the overall feeling I get about the sort of, you're a writer and Sebald's a writer and I'm a writer, and we're all writing our books and we all are selling everything out. And there's an interesting way in which, you use photographs and Sebald used photographs, and your book has the sort of truth claim of biography. And there's an interesting kind of epistemic competition between these. And I think, though, that the great thing about Speak Silence is that all of the explorations you do and fact checking you do ends up making him come out oddly stronger. I think that it's a kind of testing that happens almost like playing Bach. One of the stories about Bach and the reason he's so revered for musicians and is regarded as a classic is that counterpoint is taught using Bach. And so every generation plays Bach again, and they see, is this any good? Is it really good? Or is what we're just telling, or people telling us is good? And I had that sense of Sebald's reputation being put to a real test by this book, and surviving and coming out the other side stronger and more kind of legitimized from the angle of an extreme sympathy, because I think it's a very warm and sympathetic book, and I love the biographical voice you have, which is kind of spoken and direct and clear, and also that it's very warm in the sense of you're not being needlessly harsh or judgmental about him. So, and yet I feel like you are really subjecting him to a pretty scrupulous test, and in a way redefining or redelineating what it is to be a writer as versus what it is to be a saint, what it is to be a historian, what it is to be something else. Sebald is a writer, and he is ultimately, he's writing fictions. These are artworks, and a lot of things get churned into the making of an artwork. And what you see, what's so great about and stands alone as a book of its own in yours, is that you see all that he churned into it. Yeah, you get much more of a sense of the fullness of the achievement of gestation through a biography of this sort. So anyway, that's my long-winded way of saying congratulations.
Oh, thank you. I wish you'd written a review, Sad.
Well, I do the show. This is my review.
Yeah.
So we've come to the point where I think we should take some questions. And I had one I wanted to ask just off the top, which is, how do you see yourself as a biographer evolving from the person who wrote the Jean Rhys book, the Primo Levi book, and now this? How do you see, was this voice I describe, did that emerge fully formed, or is this something that changes book to book? Or how do you see your voice as a biographer changing over time, if at all?
Well, I mean, that's to some extent for others to say, but I mean, I wrote these three major biographies of mine over a very long period, you know. I mean, each one anyway took me best part of a decade, you know, and then I had a decade in between the Levy and the Sebald, in which I was not able to do large biographical, you know, project because I was seeing my parents out of life, basically. So, you know, inevitably there must be differences, mustn't there? And, you know, I wrote the Jean Rhys when I was in my 40s, the Levy when I was in my 50s, and I've written the Sebald in my 70s, God help me, because I'm the same age as Sebald himself. So are they different in tone? I don't know. Basically, I don't think so. I've always had the same aim in writing, you know, which has been to be direct and clear. And you know, I think that is the aim of English writing, really. So, but, you know, I think it's my relationship to the subjects that are different. I mean, people kind of guess that I must feel closest to Jean Rhys because she's a woman or something, but that's absolutely false. She's the one I feel most, you know, fascinated, intrigued from a distance. You know, she was an extraordinary person who I mean, extremely unlike. The person I felt closest to in a kind of a way was Levy. Levy, who, because I'm a biographer, so I write nonfiction. I try not to make anything up. And I try to make narrative, interesting narrative, and perhaps image-driven narrative as much as possible out of the material that I have, but I can't invent anything. I try not to. I might by mistake invent something, but I try not to. And that was Levy, really. Levy was a scientist. He was the most marvelous writer, of course. And I mean, his imagery is second to none, wonderful, beautiful things that he wrote. But I mean, he always strove for clarity and truth and straightforwardness, you know, empirical. So in a way, I felt closest to him. Also, I suppose, to be honest, he was the only Jewish one. Maybe that was an element. So in a curious way, although Levy was the one I never met Levy. I met Jean Rhys and I knew Sebald, but I never met Levy at all. And of course, he was Italian, which was a completely different culture. Very, very fascinating to, you know, learn about. So they were all very, very different. And Sebald, although you kindly say it's a warm book, my book, and I hope it is. I mean, I love and admire him. But nonetheless, I tried to be much more detached about him. I think with Levy, he was such a saint, really, that it was, I had no criticisms to make of Levy. I didn't sell Levy out, actually, apart from saying that he did commit suicide, which people didn't want to hear. But, you know, with Sebald, I felt I needed more detachment. I hope I achieved that as well.
When Sebald died, this is a question about his final project. He was working on a book about World War I, right? Can you say a little about that, what you know? Yeah,
it was about World War I and World War II, both. He called it the World War Project. We don't know very much about it because he had only done the research for it. He hadn't started writing it. And the file on it in his archive in Marbach, in the Deutsches Literaturarchiv, is closed. So, and will be closed for another, I forget now exactly, actually I think it's going to be opened next year, 23. But anyway, it's been closed. So we don't know that much about it. But yes, it was supposed to be, it started off to be about his parents' generation and how they could possibly have, you know, what it was in their education and their family situations that made them vulnerable to this appalling ideology to which they, at the very least, did not object. It's going to be about that. And then it was going to be about the First World War, about his grandfather Sebald, who fought in it, and his friend Marie's grandfather, who fought on the other side, the French side. So it was going to be about them. And then it was going to be about the Second World War as well. It was also going to be a bit about Sonthofen, where he grew up. So there were various threads, you know, once he had, because threads were the way that he wrote most of his books. Then when he came to Austerlitz, he tried to write something more with one, you know, one direction really, and one hero effectively, closer to a standard novel, although not itself a standard novel either. But then with this one, I think he was going back to his interweaving threads.
Here's the question. What did Sebald himself think of his reputation at the end of his life? How did he handle the success, is maybe another way of putting it?
Well, I genuinely believe the things that he said about this, even though, of course, I should be skeptical because of the number of lies he told me, but he did not enjoy fame. He didn't like having attention paid to him. He found that difficult. He didn't know how to cope with praise. It's quite a German thing, quite an English thing, I think. He combined both of them. It was just a personal thing. And he found everything that he had to do for his books, you know, the publicity and so on, he found incredibly strenuous and incredibly difficult. You know, he always made a joke about it. You know, this is his very gloomy way of talking about everything, which was just as gloomy as his books, even gloomier actually. But he would make it into a joke. He'd make it into a kind of performance, you see. So he would say things like, I mean, when Austerlitz came out and had rave reviews everywhere, and I actually rang him up and congratulated him and says, "It's marvelous, Max, you know, and these great reviews and everything." And he said, "Yes, and I am going to have to go to America." You know, so like he made it sound like he was, you know, it was the most awful thing that ever happened to him, you see. And that was just the way he was. And there was some truth in that. There was truth in that. He found it difficult. And when the rumor came out that he was being considered perhaps for a Nobel Prize, and he, you know, his publisher told him this, and so far from being thrilled or happy, he was like, you know, he did not want to be what's the word, you know, accepted by the establishment and given a pat on the back. He had spent his whole life being a rebel and a misfit and basically a shit kicker, and that's what he wanted to go on doing. So he was not even pleased by that.
That makes sense to me. I mean, I can see that. That actually gratifies me to hear that. One of the phrases that's used about him is a trickster, a Schelm, I think is a German. Do you think that's an accurate, do you think of him and his deceptions toward you right away as being in the mode of a trickster?
Yes, I do. And his whole way of writing, you know, as we've discussed, was tricksterish. You know, it had that two sides. It had the incredibly direct, empathetic, felt, you know, deeply disturbed, you know, element of personal relation. And then it, on the other hand, had these game playing with the photographs and with various, you know, yeah, he enjoyed trickery. He enjoyed trickery, and I think it was a form of self-protection, you know, that he played different roles. I mean, one of the things I do in my book is I use the various different nicknames that he had at different times of his life, you know, to head the different sections of his life. He did change his name, of course, entirely from Winfried Georg, as you know, to Max. And he told of Porky about that too, because he always told people he did have that Maximilian was his third name, which is not true at all. He just chose it, you know. So he had this tendency, I think he had a deep, it's not a coincidence that he became a fiction writer. He was by nature a fictionalizer, and he fictionalized his whole, you know, self-presentation, not just on the page, but in life.
Talk a bit about his house. You know, he had that, it was so important that he built this house, and yet when he built it, he felt kind of depressed. And I thought that was an interesting urge he had to tell us about the house he built. He built some of it himself, right? He renovated it, I guess would be the way.
He and his wife, they bought it in 1975, and it was a ruin, you know, which is how they could afford to buy it, because he was, as you say, was a rather, for a long time, not an undistinguished academic, but kept at quite a low level. He wasn't not promoted from lecturer to senior lecturer for about, you know, 15 years. And so he didn't have a very high salary, and they couldn't afford a marvelous house. And so they found this thing that was a complete wreck. And so they could buy it. So they did buy it. And then they spent the next 2 years restoring it themselves. I mean, obviously they had to have some people wire it and so on, but basically they did all the work themselves. And Max in particular did the garden. He was a good gardener and loved that. And, so he tamed this massive, they had a large garden. It was an old Victorian rectory, very large, beautiful building. I mean, and they made it into the most beautiful, lovely place. And it's like an image of peace, in the English countryside. And I think that's what he wanted it to be. That's what he strove for. And I think that part of it, this is just my speculation. This is completely just my idea. I have no proof of it, of course. But I think his first experience of a house like that was the one that he lived in that belonged to Dr. Henry Selwyn, who was a doctor really called Dr. Buckton. And I think it was that house in a village called Wyndham, which was his first encounter with the kind of place that he loved, which is a beautiful old house that sits in its valley, in its place where it's been for hundreds of years and has been peaceful and integrated and unchanging, and it's got the past in it. He was always looking for places that had the past in it, particularly because he felt that Germany had always cleared away the past. So I think that when he made that house with his wife, that rectory, the old rectory outside Norwich in a village called Poringland, he was inspired, I think, by the house that he describes in Dr. Henry Selwyn.
Someone is asking another question about the photographs. Could you compare Sebald's altered photos with Virginia Woolf's fake photos in her mock biography, Orlando? Do his altered photographs project his uncertainty about history that he mixes with fiction as a kind of truth?
Yeah, I think that's very acute and very right. I mean, that that was, as a writer, he was extremely interested in the elusiveness of truth and the way that a photograph, which we always imagine is like, that's it, you have a photograph of it, that proves it was really, we take a photograph to be of reality. But of course, we all know that's not true. I mean, long before photoshopping and so on was always possible to fake and adjust photographs in one way or another. And they don't prove anything really. And he puts a photograph in, I think it's Max Ferber, the photograph you remember of the book burning in Würzburg. And this is, photograph, it's at night and there's smoke coming up and so on. And this is a fake photograph. It's clearly faked. Now, the book burning in Würzburg did happen. It actually happened, that's true. But the, this is the German edition. I don't know which page it's on now. The photograph itself is a fake. And he discusses this. Yes, it's in the German edition.
This one?
That doesn't help.
Is it this one?
No, it's this. Can you see?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
And
it's clearly a fake photograph, and he has a whole long description of how this turns out to be a fake, and how and he's of course commenting on the photographs in his own. It's a self-reflective thing. Don't believe these photographs necessarily, query them. And he said it in interviews. He said, that was a point at which I just laid it out to the reader. Watch out. So he was doing both things. He was both trying to give you an experience of reality beyond the normal fictional one. And, in a very sophisticated, postmodern way, making you face the fact that perhaps these photographs are completely misleading and this whole thing is not what it seems to be.
Yes, that's the part that's very destabilizing, and it is truly postmodern, and is what makes him truly an artist, I think, too, is the willingness to do that to the kind of grander, nobler project of honoring the dead and honoring the Jewish Holocaust and so forth. It comes back to this notion of the trickster, really, and the artist trickster, and the illusionist and so forth. Yeah.
Yes, but there's a tension there, isn't there? And there's quite a disturbing, worrying tension. I mean, to have used those postmodern devices about various sorts of stories is one thing. To use them in, hook them up with that other project, which is so important to what he's trying to do is convey a reality. I mean, it's a puzzle, it's a puzzle. And I think it may be a kind of a trap, but it's a very creative trap. And it's something that, you know, his genius rises out of.
Yes, absolutely. I think the risk he's running is the risk of art. And yeah, well, I think we're going to have to leave it there, Carole. That was tremendous. Thank you very much for speaking to me today. I will hold the book up again here. You can get it on bookshops.org, and it's around everywhere, really. I'd also like to thank Kai Bird and Shelby White, our benefactor at the Leon Levy Foundation, for supporting this event and all our other events. And thanks to the audience for coming out today at this odd hour for the United States. See you, and thank you again, Carole. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.